Good morning. This is going to be our first lecture of our nervous system series. Arguably, I believe the nervous system is going to be one of the most important systems that we'll cover. It provides a good framework of how the body works and how it integrates the other systems to comprise the whole organism. Before you begin diving into the nervous system, it's important to understand the overview of the nervous system. So, it's going to be responsible for behaviors, memories, and movements. So, movements is going to be primarily your peripheral nervous system, whereas behaviors and memories is going to be primarily your central nervous system. So, when we talk about the central nervous system, as you'll see later on in slides, it's going to consist of the brain and the spinal cord. Um, so you're going to have the brain and the spinal cord, which is going to be primarily responsible for behaviors and memories, and your movements is going to come from something called the peripheral nervous system, which is going to be coming from the spinal nerves and some of the cranial nerves, um, extending out to the musculature. So the branch of medical science that deals with the nervous system is called neurology. So ology is the study of, so ology, the study of the nervous system. And the nervous system, again, along with these three important functions, it's responsible for maintaining something that we call homeostasis. And homeostasis is just a fancy word for uh, uh, keeping in balance, right? Remember, we don't want um, our body to go into one extreme or the other. We like it to maintain in that normal, happy medium. So here is a picture telling you about the central nervous system. Here's a picture of the brain connected with the spinal cord. Again, this picture is important, not necessarily the picture itself, but just understanding the central nervous system as well as the peripheral nervous system. The peripheral nervous system, again, is in the periphery. These are the spinal nerves coming out here. There's 31 pair. And your cranial nerves, again, are within the cranium. There's 12 of them, 12 pairs, and it's responsible for things like olfaction, smell, sight, which is going to consist of cranial nerves 2, 3, and 4. This is sight and also moving your eyes up and down, medial and lateral. Cranial nerve uh, 7 is the facial nerve. So the facial nerve is also responsible for helping control the musculature of the face, also has some sensory functions. Cranial nerve 8 is going to be the vestibulocular nerve. This is going to be responsible for hearing and balance. Cranial nerve 9 is the glossopharyngeal nerve. It has some different functions to do with the tongue and some of the muscles of the pharynx. Cranial nerve 10 is the vagus nerve. It has, again, some motor and sensory functions as well. Cranial nerve 11 is going to be the accessory nerve. This helps raise the trapezius muscle. And cranial nerve 12 is the hypoglossal nerve, which helps you stick out your tongue and move it. So, again, these nerves have both sensory and motor functions, and we'll talk about what sensory and motor functions are. So, here again, just an overview of the major structures. You have 12 pair of cranial nerves and 31 pair of spinal nerves. And if you remember, cranial nerves and spinal nerves make up something called the peripheral nervous system, right? Whereas the brain and the spinal cord make up the central nervous system. We talked here about enteric plexuses helping regulate the digestive system, and plexus is just a fancy word for a group of nerves. Then you'll hear about something called ganglia, and this is just a collection of nervous tissue, right? Primarily the cell bodies of neurons. So, sensory receptors are either parts of neurons or specialized cells that monitor changes in internal or external environment. And we're going to talk about that in more detail. This is an important slide, knowing the different functions of the nervous system, right? So you're going to have a sensory, integrative function, and a motor function. Um, if you guys remember, we talked about maintaining homeostasis, talking about the different components of this. We talked about the stimuli coming into the sensor going to the integrator, and then the integrator going to the output, right? The effector. So the sensory function is going to receive a stimulus, and this I used in class an example of somebody maybe curling their hair or straightening their hair, and they burn their hair or they burn their arm on their straightener. You know that pain is going to be the initial input, right? There's a hot stimulus that touches the skin, and we have sensory receptors for nerve endings present within the skin that's going to sense this, and it's going to send it up to the brain, which is going to be our integrator, right? It's going to have an integrative function, and this is going to analyze the information that comes in and tell us how to make a decision based on that. So, as you all know, if you have ever burnt yourself, the immediate reaction is to jerk your arm away. This is the motor function, right? This is our ability to respond to the stimulus by initiating action, right? So we have a sensory afferent neuron, which sends information in to the integrator, right? These interneurons are going to serve this function right here. This is where our associations and analyzation of, or analyzing the input comes in. And then the motor function is going to be an efferent neuron, which is going to allow us to respond to the stimulus. So again, a sensory function, an integrative function, and a motor function. So here we just break down definitions. We talk about the divisions of the central nervous system. We have the central nervous system, again, being in the central portion of the body, the brain and the spinal cord. And then we have the peripheral nervous system being in the periphery, right? This is going to consist of our cranial nerves and our spinal nerves. They're going to contain both sensory and motor functions, right? They're responsible for connecting the central nervous system, right, the brain and the spinal cord, to muscles, glands, and all sensory receptors. This is a good picture of a neuron, and you have some type of stimulus or input coming into these little appendages right here. I call them octopus arms. I know they're not, but kind of looks like that a little bit. But these are the dendrites. So the dendrites have receptors which receive some type of input from a stimulus. This could be in the form of pain or in the form of light or whatever stimulus may be being input. From here, they go to the cell body, and from the cell body, they travel down the axon, right? The axon generates action potentials and carries the action potential down. And the action potential is just electrical excitability, and that's important to know, right? So the action potential is just electrical excitability. So you have an input here that comes to the cell body, and the cell body is going to be primarily responsible for generation of neurotransmitters and protein synthesis. And from here, you're going to have action potentials that are transmitted down the axon. And eventually, it'll come to something called the presynaptic terminal here, where the neurotransmitter is released. There is something called myelin here that's generated by Schwann cells within the peripheral nervous system. And this myelin is going to help the action potential conduct at a faster rate. So that's important to know. As Sean said in lecture, it helps insulate the axon, right? Because it insulates it, it helps with conduction, helps conduct these electrical impulses at a quicker rate. So neuron is a functional unit of the nervous system. Okay, so we talked about the sarcomere being the functional unit of the muscular system. Well, the neuron is the functional unit of the nervous system, and it has the capacity to produce something that we call action potentials. And action potentials is a fancy word for electrical excitability, right? And when we talk about electricity, we're talking about it in the forms of positive and negative potentials. And these positive and negative potentials are going to be generated by something called ions. And when we talk about ions, if you can remember back to chemistry, this is just going to be if you remember the periodic table of elements, it's just going to be any element that has a charge. So sodium, Na plus, that positive charge is going to be something that we call an ion. Okay, potassium, right? K minus, or I apologize, K plus. So this potassium is again going to have a charge related to it. So it's the differences in these ions across this gradient that is going to establish this electrical membrane potential. And this is what is going to generate these action potentials. Okay, I know that's a lot, but for our basis right now, I want you to know that the neuron is the functional unit of the nervous system. The neuron is going to generate something called action potentials, and action potentials are they have electrical excitability, right? And this electrical excitability is due to the generation of ions, right? It's a difference in ion concentration across this gradient. Here we talk about a little bit of the structure of the neuron. There's something called the cell body. So the cell body is where most of the protein synthesis occurs. If you can remember back to the basics of Bio 112, we talked about the rough ER and how the rough ER is responsible for protein synthesis, and free ribosomes responsible for protein synthesis as well. So this is again where some of our neurotransmitters, which are going to be our chemical mediators, which help carry these chemical messages across the synapse. This is where they're going to be synthesized. Microtubules are going to be responsible, if you remember back again to Bio 112, for movement. Microtubules are a intermediate filament which help move materials inside and outside of the cell. And the neurofilaments are going to give the cell shape and support. So what's important about the cell body? This is where protein synthesis occurs, where neurotransmitters are going to be primarily synthesized. And then we come down to something called the cell processes. And the cell processes is just a big fancy word for the dendrites and the axons. Okay, you can come back up here to our picture here. You'll see the dendrites, which are going to be our appendages, which kind of receive this input into the neuron. And again, the axon is going to carry the message away. You can remember axon away, right, away from the cell body. Um, uh, like to remind myself that axon carries action potentials, right? The A for axon, the A for action potential. Just a silly little way that I kind of like to remember things. So here we have a picture here just showing you the different types of neurons. You have something called a multipolar neuron, okay, something called a bipolar neuron, and something called a unipolar neuron. And again, we'll go into this in a little bit more detail. The primary thing that I want you to see here is the functions of dendrites. Here, you see the dendrites are going to receive a message, right, and then they're going to carry it down the axon to the cell body, and again, carrying it away through the axon to other dendrites, right? It's a bipolar neuron because it is containing multiple dendrites here. So here, the cell body is the location for most protein synthesis. And again, we've already talked about that, right? This is the location of the rough endoplasmic reticulum and the free ribosomes where protein synthesis is occurring. There's two different types of transport that occurs within the neuron, something called slow axonal flow and something called fast axonal flow. And these words just kind of denote, again, how quickly they move, but also the direction. So slow axonal transport is going to occur in only one direction only, right, away from the cell body. Whereas fast axonal flow is going to occur in either direction. Is this important for examination purposes? No, it's not. But again, this is just a little bit more detail so that you guys can understand how neurotransmission works. Here's a picture again of the different sensory receptors that we've touched on back in the muscular lecture about the Meissners and the Merkels, the tactile disc, how this is going to detect fine touch and discriminatory touch as well. There's going to be an input that comes in here, and again, this is going to be transmitted through the dendrites here, down the axon again to the cell body, and again through the axon here to the dendrites. So this is kind of, again, the basis of how neurotransmission works. Again, this is just a picture kind of denoting that to you guys. Same thing. Getting down to here, we're going to talk about the neuroglia of the central nervous system, and these glial cells are just going to be a type of support cell. So each form myelin around more than one axon in the central nervous system. I want you to do, I do want to point out the word Schwann cell, okay? Schwann cell, and I want you to make a note of this, and again, you might see this on a future exam or on a quiz in the near future, but Schwann cells are going to be responsible for this myelination, right? This myelin, myelination, myelination of the axons. And why is myelination important for the axons? Again, we said that axons are going to be responsible for carrying action potentials down their gradient to the presynaptic terminal where the neurotransmitter is able to be released. Well, these axons, right, are myelinated in order to increase the conduction speed, right? So this myelin helps insulate the axon, which allows it to transmit messages at a quicker rate. So you have both myelinated neurons within your body, right? And you have unmyelinated. So which of the two do you think would carry a message quicker? Exactly, it would be the myelinated neurons, right? It's due to this myelin that insulates it that allows conduction to occur at a quicker rate. Here's a picture here just kind of showing you some of the different glial cells which are going to be present within the central nervous system. There's a bunch here that I'm not going to go into too much detail at this time. There's something called the oligodendrocyte. There's something called the microglial cell, which is a phagocytic scavenger type cell, which is going to be responsible for breaking down cellular debris. Here's a neuron here. As you can see here, extending out from it are these axons, which are containing these um, this myelination, which is being produced from this oligodendrocyte here. Um, I won't spend too much more time on that. So the neuroglia of the peripheral nervous system, we talk about these myelin generating cells being generated from the Schwann cell. So if you zoom in on this picture, which I don't know if I can do, but you'll see a Schwann cell, and this Schwann cell is generating this myelin, and this myelin sheath is going to allow this action potential to be generated at a quicker rate. Here's a better picture of this. You've got a Schwann cell here, which is generating this myelin sheath around this axon. And again, this is going to increase the rate of conduction. So here we talk about Schwann cells myelinating or wrapping around the axon in the peripheral nervous system during fetal development, right? So the tube guides growing axons that are repairing themselves. So there is something called regeneration, which can occur if there is a neuron that is damaged due to some reason. These Schwann cells can help regenerate this myelin sheath within the peripheral nervous system. Here's another picture here showing you myelinated and unmyelinated axons. Again, the Schwann cell present up here. You'll see that it's myelinating, it's wrapping itself around this neuron, this axon right here. And then you'll see the unmyelinated portion of the axon as well. This goes into a little bit about the central nervous system within the brain and the spinal cord. So you have somatic sensory receptors, right? These sensory receptors receive some type of message and they send it to the brain and the spinal cord. And from there, the brain and the spinal cord are then going to send it to the somatic motor neurons for voluntary contraction of the muscular system. We have something called the autonomic nervous system. The autonomic nervous system is made up of two branches that we'll discuss later on, the sympathetic and the parasympathetic nervous system. The sympathetic nervous system is going to be your fight or flight system. This is going to be responsible for things like increasing your heart rate, dilating your pupils, slowing down digestion, things that are, if you ever experience some type of perceived threat, maybe you're hunting and maybe you come upon a bear, your fight or flight system kind of kicks into gear to help preserve your body, right? It increases your heart rate so you can pump more blood to the rest of your body. It dilates your lungs, your bronchi, in order to increase the amount of oxygen that you're able to take in exchange. And it increases your pupil size so you have a better ability to perceive any unwanted threats. Whereas the parasympathetic nervous system is going to be the other branch of the autonomic nervous system. This is often called the rest and digest system. The rest and digest system, I like to think about this as if you're in Pikeville and you go to Hardee's and you eat lunch. What happens after you eat? You begin to start undergoing digestion. Right, you're resting. Your heart rate it's at a chilled. It's not 110 as if a bear is after you. Right, it's more in the 70s and 80s. You're relaxed. Right. Um, Digestion is able to occur. Again, we wouldn't want us to have to go to the bathroom right when a bear's chasing us. Um, the pupils are at a normal rate or at a normal size. They may be constricted. So these are just a few things that can occur. Right? This autonomic nervous system is going to receive some type of sensory input, whether it be a perceived threat or maybe it might be some food stimulating the parasympathetic nervous system, whatever it may be. But then it sends an input to the central nervous system, right, the brain and the spinal cord, and from there it sends it down to the automatic motor neurons, the sympathetic and parasympathetic division. So we have a sensory input, which goes to the central nervous system, which will then generate an output to the motor neurons of the sympathetic and parasympathetic divisions. Okay. So the enteric nervous system, only thing I really want you to know about the enteric nervous system is that it is going to be responsible for controlling the GI tract, right? This is going to control digestion. So coming down here, these are important definitions or subdivisions of the peripheral nervous system to be aware of. There's something called the somatic nervous system, the autonomic nervous system, and the enteric nervous system. So again, just to go back, we have the central nervous system, which is made up of the brain and the spinal cord. Then we have the peripheral nervous system, which is made up of the cranial nerves and the spinal nerves. We're going to talk about subdivisions of this peripheral nervous system. Okay, it's kind of good to keep all this stuff in check. I know we're learning a lot of new words and a lot of new ideas, so it's important to keep these kind of grouped together. So the somatic nervous system is going to be the neurons from the cutaneous, right, or skin, and special sensory receptors to the central nervous system, so to the brain. This contains motor neurons, which are going to go to skeletal muscle fibers. So this is voluntary contraction. This is how we move. So the autonomic involuntary nervous system, right, this is going to be the sympathetic and parasympathetic divisions that we previously talked about. So this is going to be primarily visceral organs, which are going to go to the central nervous system, and which are going to have motor output to the smooth and cardiac muscle and glands. So again, the autonomic nervous systems are going to be our visceral organs, which go to the central nervous system, and from there, we're going to have motor output to the smooth and cardiac muscle and glands. Now, knowing the sympathetic division speeds up the heart rate and the parasympathetic division slows down the heart rate, that'll be important for us to learn. And again, the enteric nervous system, I'm not going to kill you too much on, but just know this is going to be our sensory and motor neuronal control of our GI tract. So we get down here and we talk about how action potentials are generated. And again, we talked about how this comes down to electrical excitability. So neurons are electrically excitable due to a change in voltage difference, okay? This is a voltage difference that is going to be present across their membranes. And remember, I talked about how it's the flow of ions that occurs throughout these channels, which is going to be responsible for this difference in voltage potential. There's two types of electrical signals. Action potential and graded potential. I primarily want you to know action potentials for our purposes at this time, right? So these are the different types of ion channels, and we'll talk about these. That the names kind of make sense. Mechanically gated ion channels are going to respond to mechanical vibration or pressure. Voltage gated are again going to be due to changes in membrane potential, right? This is due to they open or close due to the presence of a certain membrane potential. Ligand-gated channels are going to respond to some type of stimulus. So acetylcholine binding to its receptor, that would be an example of a ligand-gated channel. And these leakage non-gated channels are always open. Okay, these are going to be your potassium channels, which are going to be present within the plasma membrane of some of these neurons, which are going to allow for the resting membrane potential to be established. So leakage, non-gated channels, these leak channels are going to be constantly open. These ligand-gated channels are going to respond to a type of stimulus. These voltage-gated channels are going to respond to changes in membrane potential. These mechanically gated ion channels are going to change due to vibration or pressure. So just having an idea of these will be important for examination purposes. Here's a picture that's kind of depicting what we've previously just talked about. Here are the leak channels showing you that they're open, right? The potassium channels leaking through here, helping establish this resting membrane potential. As you can see here, this extracellular fluid, this potassium is leaking across here into the cytosol, okay? I apologize, the cytosol has these potassium channels, or potassium ions, in which they're leaking across into the extracellular fluid. Here, again, you're seeing acetylcholine binding to its receptor, opening this ligand-gated channel, which is allowing ions to diffuse across. Mechanical, there's some type of mechanical stimulus which opens the channel and allows ions to come across. This could be due to a change of vibration or pressure. And again, here, this is just an example of a voltage-gated channel, opening or closing due to the presence of a change in membrane potential. Here we have -70, which is usually about the resting membrane potential before the action potential is able to be generated, set around -70. But once we have more sodium or more of an ion diffusing into the extracellular fluid. This is going to change the membrane potential to about -50, right? More positive ions are going across, making it less negative. Therefore, there's a change in the membrane potential. So I believe that is where I'm going to stop for the first portion of our lecture series. We covered quite a bit in just a small amount of time. So I just want you to go back and kind of understand the divisions of the central and the peripheral nervous system, understand the importance of these ligand gated channels, and just familiarize yourself with the different sensory and motor functions of the different systems. So if you have any questions, I encourage you to please reach out to me. I would love to sit down with you and kind of discuss this more in detail. But this will conclude the first portion of our lecture preview series dealing with the nervous system. Thank you.